Hey, what's going on, guys? You are listening to the Road to Rip podcast, and we have a special guest today. We have Brian St. Pierre from Precision Nutrition. And hey, what's going on, Tom? How are you?
I'm doing great, man. How are you?
Pretty good.
Excellent, Brian. Welcome to the Road to Rip podcast, man. Little did I know, actually, when we first reached out to you, you were actually like a huge figure within Precision Nutrition, and it wasn't until I started reading a lot of the articles like on the site, because I thought it was just all John Berardi on the site, and come to find out that you're one of the main nutrition figures behind Precision Nutrition, right?
Yeah, it's a common, I guess, misconception because our article title, like the author name, is in small writing because really it's, we really want it to be about the content and less about, splashing someone's name across it. But absolutely, I do a lot of nutrition work. JB and I work hand in hand on a lot of projects like our precision nutrition system and certification. So I'm highly involved in all that stuff for sure.
Awesome. Well, Greg, we have tons of content to cover today in this episode. So, do you guys just want to fire away?
Yeah, we'll fire it away. I mean, first off, as we were chatting earlier, let's talk a little bit about the paleo diet and what your thoughts are with it as far as using it as a tool to improve health and even optimize performance. And I mean, what are your thoughts on the paleo and obviously paleo? There's so many different ways to interpret it and how you can utilize it. But I guess we'll just leave it at that for now.
I mean, I think there are. I have a lot of thoughts on the paleo diet, and it really, in many ways, the answer is almost always it depends. Right, it depends on a lot of things, but that's not a very helpful answer. No one could take any action from that answer. So really, I actually just wrote a really big article on the PN site about the paleo diet, and really, to me, what it comes down to is, no matter which end of the spectrum you stand on, paleo is awesome, paleo misses the point. In the end, the actual diet in and of itself likely gets more right than it gets wrong. You're getting lots of lean protein, lots of fruits and vegetables. Though it limits the carb sources more than I would like, you're getting in some quality carbs, some healthy fats from nuts and things like that. So it's minimizing greatly like processed foods. It also recommends, sunshine, exercise, fresh air. Like there are a lot of components of the paleo diet that I really like and I think could help vast majority of the people out there. There are other elements where I think it's too restrictive, unnecessarily so. Restrictive on grains, restrictive on legumes especially, overly restrictive on dairy, that I think could push some people away because it's harder to stick to when it's more restrictive. It's easier short-term, harder long-term when it's more restrictive. And so that's why you see people cycle through so many types of diets, right? That's what ends up happening. So in that regard, I think that's part of the reason why the paleo diet has evolved over the past few years especially. Right? A lot of paleo advocates used to be really hardcore low-carb in addition to paleo. Now you're seeing greater emphasis of carbohydrates in the paleo diet. More sweet potatoes, more of just a little bit more of a relaxed attitude, starting with that more strict template, and then integrating things and seeing how you respond. Trying some dairy, trying some dark chocolate, trying some legumes, and seeing how your body responds to it. So if people use it from that construct with that template, I think it could be awesome.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know quite a few people that have had like various, even just health symptoms, and when they adjusted their diet to going quote unquote paleo, they feel a lot better. And obviously, a lot of that could be eating more lean protein and vegetables and fruits. But I guess there is something to say about some of these foods. People just don't do well on. And I know me personally. I know the gluten thing gets a lot of flack, like, oh, you're going gluten-free, but no, actually, like, I have a gluten sensitivity, and I know that's kind of arbitrary and whatnot, but I've always, felt much better away from gluten, and I don't, I'm not paleo myself, but I do kind of agree with some of the stuff, and the only thing is, what you kind of talked about earlier, there's unnecessary restrictions. I've always found, kind of, me personally, I don't know if you can relate to this, just the whole, like, basing the diet initially off of picking foods you can have and you can't have, it screws me up psychologically.
Mm-hmm.
I hate it. I'd rather figure out the amount of macros or calories that I can work into my day and then gravitate to whatever foods I want to hit those goals. That just makes it so much easier for me.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I'm not a big fan of like the you can eat this but you can't eat this type of diet, because it ends up creating like an all or none type of mindset, right? Well, that's bad, this is good. When people get into those type of mindsets, they're either on the diet or they're off the diet, right? And that's not a recipe for success long term. It's not about a diet or dieting or being on or off. It's about just eating pretty well most of the time. That'll get most people where they want to go. So yeah, there are definitely people who do better without gluten. There are people who do better without broccoli, right? No matter how healthy a food might be, and in all seriousness, there are people who it doesn't agree with, whether it's green tea or it could be anything, right? There's any number of foods that people have issues with. So that's why we tend to be what we call nutritional agnostics at Precision Nutrition. No matter how healthy an approach might be in general, you have to adjust it for each person and their particular needs, dietary intolerances, goals, things like that.
Right, and I guess, I mean, you kind of touched on a few things, but I guess what do you think the biggest kind of mistakes or unnecessary food eliminations are there with the paleo diet? Like,
I'd say the biggest one is just eliminating legumes off the top.
okay.
You look at the data on eating beans and lentils and things, it's nearly unequivocal in their support. The amount of people who have issues with legumes are very, very small, and even the issues that they cite in paleo spheres it's not strong data. It's just not. When you look at the controlled trial evidence, observational evidence, the history of eating legumes, humans have been eating legumes even in Paleolithic times, and even in substantial amounts, it's estimated. So it's just not there. I just find that to be the strangest one to eliminate.
Okay, very interesting. And I've always like not been down to eliminate dairy because I've always like loved
Me too.
yeah, specifically like cheeses, like some kind of cheese from skim milk. It just the high protein, calcium, and I find it very, very satiating. In fact, I will take, as far as getting lean is concerned, I will take dairy over nuts any day. And it tastes so good. What are your? I guess is there merit in eliminating dairy for health or body composition goals? I mean, what are your thoughts there?
Yes and no. I mean, personally, I like dairy. I eat dairy every day. Generally, just a little bit of butter and some yogurt. But to think that eliminating dairy in and of itself is just going to get people leaner, it'll get you leaner if it decreases your calorie intake. But in and of itself, it's not inherently fattening or even unhealthy, especially as more and more controlled trial evidence comes out. For people who can tolerate it, who don't have a lactose intolerance, don't have a casein allergy or another type of milk allergy, it's a pretty solid food, especially if you can get it from cows that are mostly grass-fed, outside, which can be harder. That's not the majority of dairy. Fortunately, where I live in Maine, that's very easy to come by. And there are other great resources. There's a survey by the Cornucopia Institute where they surveyed all the organic dairies in the U.S. and then based on their responses gave them scores. And so, of course, some of the big name companies like Horizon, right, owned by Dean Foods, the biggest food manufacturer in the U.S., wouldn't respond. Other big companies wouldn't respond because they're not willing to be transparent about their practices. Whereas Organic Valley and all kinds of smaller, more regional producers responded. And you can see organic dairy producers and which ones actually produce higher quality milk. And that's something that I think is valuable to know. And if you're going to consume dairy, that's where I would push people towards.
Okay, yeah, that's probably. I've been really lazy, so I've been getting the Kraft shredded cheese made from skim milk. It's actually got pretty good macros. But yeah, I don't know. I don't think they do the organic pre-shredded cheese.
They might. I'm not sure. Actually, they do. Organic Valley does sell pre-shredded organic cheese.
Oh my!
But, in the end, it's not like that's going to make or break your entire health, right? If that's your one bad food, But if I was to encourage people to make a choice, that's the direction I would encourage.
Okay, cool. And just earlier you mentioned how if cutting out dairy helps you reduce your calorie consumption, then yes, it'll help you get lean. And I guess that's one kind of tricky area with the paleo diet is that yes, it gets you to cut out a lot of easily over to consume calories. But at the same time, if you pick up a paleo recipe book, the calorie density of a lot of these meals is crazy. I mean, you're getting like really fatty cuts of meat. You're using tons of coconut oil and like making stuff with like ground almond. And so a lot of these meals, I mean, even though you're cutting back on a lot of easy to consume foods, it kind of balances out. I mean, I did the paleo diet a few years ago, and I had a hard time eating less than 3,000 calories with like the paleo style meals.
And that's when you look at like the controlled trials of paleo diet versus Mediterranean diet, whatever. In those versions of the paleo diet, they weren't eating meals like that, like super high fat. They're actually eating pretty high protein, so their total calorie intake came down because of the high protein content. Right. I mean, we consistently see that in the literature. When people eat more protein, their total calorie intake tends to come down. When you look at a lot of paleo diet cookbooks, you're right. Like they pound coconuts and almonds, and in some instances, if they allow butter, tons of like ghee, or if you're practicing like the bulletproof coffee, some people in the paleo sphere are now doing huge things of bulletproof coffee plus their high-fat meals. I mean, you're talking like 200 grams of fat a day. While that can be done, if you really know what you're doing, for most people that tends to be an issue, and they're eating more calories than they realize for sure. And I've seen it over and over again with clients who are trying the paleo diet and having issues.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now let's switch gears here, and this is definitely a topic that Tom and I enjoy quite a bit, and that's intermittent fasting. I know a couple years ago, it might have been 2 or 3 years ago, John Berardi did this extensive intermittent fasting experiment, and he had a lot of pretty cool conclusions. And so I guess what do people like really need to know about intermittent fasting, and if it's beneficial for them, and what kind of benefits are there with fasting as opposed to a higher meal frequency?
I mean, when JB did it, what he really found was, for him personally, his study of N=1, was that it wasn't any more effective for him to lose weight than his traditional dieting approach, but he was more easily able to keep it off, and he was more easily able to manage hunger, which is super important when you're trying to diet down, because hunger is a big reason why people fall off their diets, right? They're eating less calories than they need, so their body's ramping up hunger signals, and he just found when he would do fasting, your hunger tends to come in waves. So when you just fast for a little while, and then you're able to eat in a smaller time window, you can eat bigger meals and kind of get away with it more, because your total calorie intake is what it would normally be if you were just spacing them out. So in that regard, he found it really helpful. In our coaching programs, we've just found we actually have people fast for a day just to experience what it's like, and then a lot of people after that will just try with it. They'll experiment with it moving forward. And what we've really found is it's most beneficial in younger males who are already pretty lean. So let's say a 25-year-old guy who's 15 or 14% body fat and wants to be 10, that's where we find it to be most beneficial. If someone is 45 and 25% body fat for a male, or 35-40% for a female, and especially for females, it's not any more effective than your regular quote-unquote approach, unless it just helps you control your intake more. But for some people, we find fasting becomes, again, part of that like all or none mindset. If they don't fast that day, or their fasting falls through, they tend to get guilty over it and antsy over it, because they have this predefined idea of success, and that success revolves around their fasting window. So from a physiology standpoint, it can have some benefit, but again, what we've really found, even the literature is starting to agree, it's most beneficial in young, already relatively lean males, and the least beneficial for women. It seems to impact them negatively in terms of blood lipids. It can impact them negatively in terms of sleep, simply because their hormonal profile maybe isn't as well suited to it. There's lots of speculation as to the exact reasoning. I don't think anyone really knows for sure, but for women it seems to be the least effective for health improvements or body composition improvements and things like that.
Right. It's very interesting. I mean, anecdotally, I've always noticed that most guys tend to do fine on it, or they absolutely love it. And women, it's very like iffy. It's very, you get both sides. I know Tom's fiance, she didn't do well on fasting at all. And I don't. Yeah.
Well, yeah, actually, when we first started doing the Kino Body Nutrition Plan, I mean, because you're a huge advocate of intermittent fasting, and that's actually where I heard about it from when I started to get into your courses, and then I started researching it, and I love it. Honestly, I think it's the easiest way to stay within my macro, count every single day, and it's like natural for me now. It's second nature. My fiance Emily, she was absolutely. We did it for the first week. She was
Hmm.
absolutely miserable. And I mean, she's just one. I don't know if it's just like if it's just ladies or what, but like she has to eat breakfast within maybe like an hour of waking up. If she doesn't have that, like I can drink coffee. I usually fast for the first 5 hours of waking, 4 to 5 hours, and that's actually where I do my training too. So I train fasted, and then I come home within a couple hours later. I have my lunch. It's a huge meal. It's like really satisfying. She's miserable. So
Hmm.
after the first week, she's like, nope, ain't for me. And so she started, eating smoothies, a lighter breakfast. But yeah, it's just, it's crazy how it affects, guys and girls so differently.
Absolutely. I mean, I personally did it for 10 months after I started working for PN, after talking to JB about it. And I was like, well, how can I really talk about it if I've never really tried it?
Hmm.
So I did like the 16-8, lean gain style for about 10 months. But all I did was take my breakfast and my normal like 10 o'clock mid-morning snack and just combined it all at 10 o'clock. So I get up at like 5 o'clock in the morning. So I too was
Hmm.
awake for like 5 hours before I ate. So my total calorie intake was the same. And for me, I noticed absolutely no benefit and absolutely no harm. My training was just as good, fasted or fed. My recovery felt the same. My energy level, sleep, it didn't affect me. Like honestly, it was like I did nothing different for me. Um, so I still
Yeah.
felt great. I still trained well. I was just as strong. I was the same body composition. I enjoyed it, but at the same time, like my kids are getting a little older now, so we like eat breakfast together. So I prefer, just in my lifestyle to eat breakfast and enjoy it with my kids. So to me, I'm like again, it comes back to at PN especially, we are very results oriented. If you do intermittent fasting and it works for you, then by all means keep doing it, right? But if you do it and it doesn't work for you, don't just stick to it because it's supposed to work or it worked for somebody else, right? Or it works for your fiance, right? So
Hmm.
if Emily kept doing it even though it worked for you, but she was miserable, what good is that? That's not actually
Right.
helping her.
Hmm.
Right. So
So be
then,
results oriented.
right. So then I guess now it's logical to kind of talk about like really as far as getting lean is concerned or building muscle. I mean, like intermittent fasting is a tool that can help some people
Right.
make life easier as far as hitting macros or just making meals. It's easier to cook 2 meals than it is to have, well, I guess depending on the meal prep and whatnot, then make 6. But what is getting lean and how important like is the macros over the course of the day, and then what are your thoughts on like meal timing in regards to workouts, pre and post workout?
Yeah, so I mean, when it comes to macros over the course of a day, I am definitely a big picture guy. So to me, total intake is far more important than any nutrient timing strategy. Doesn't mean nutrient timing is irrelevant. It still has a place. It's just when you look at the literature as it's continued to grow. And Alan Aragon's done like 2 phenomenal research reviews in the past couple of years that I've been fortunate to chat with him about. Really, what it shows is as long as you have a good chunk of protein and carbs within an hour or two before and an hour or two after your workouts, you're probably going to get the vast majority of the nutrient timing, if not all of the benefits of nutrient timing protocols. So it doesn't have to be, when I was in college, man, I had some fast digesting protein and carbs pre-workout, sipped it during my workout, had another one after my workout, then ate again like an hour later. It was crazy. Like I was eating like 8 times a day. Right? You want to talk about ease of meal prep? Like at PN, we generally recommend people eat about 4 times a day, just as a starting point. We just find that tends to be the sweet spot. Reasonably sized meals, they're filling and satisfying, not so big that people feel like Thanksgiving, right? They're just overly stuffed. Some
Hmm.
people don't like that feeling. So 4 meals we find to be good sized meals, satisfying, not so much food prep. You're constantly thinking about food, or you're prepping 6 different meals a day, it's difficult. It's exhausting. You're constantly thinking about it. And it still allows you to utilize nutrient timing to some degree. Because if you're eating 4 times a day, that's about 4 hours between each meal. So if you eat let's say I'll give myself for an example. Eat breakfast at like 6, snack at 10. I tend to work out around 8 o'clock in the morning. This is what works for my schedule. So I'll work out from like 8 to 9, come home, shower, whatever, and then I have a super shake, so a smoothie at like 10 o'clock. So I eat breakfast at 6, 2 hours later I work out for an hour, and then an hour after that I have a smoothie. So I'm bookending, my training with 2 good-sized mixed meals, plenty of protein, plenty of carbs, and then making sure still that my total intake for the day is in place. So they're both important. So a very long-winded answer to a short question.
No, fair enough. I guess it's important to stress upon because a lot of people get hung up on as you're saying, obsessing about their post workout and during workout shakes, and they don't even bother tabulating their entire macros of the day, which is vastly more important. And I guess one phenomenon that I see some people make is their goal will be to get like really, really lean, but then they'll be adding all these pre, during, post workout shakes, and it's like invisible calories to them. They make it harder to lean down because they're taking in a bunch of fast absorbing and very minimally satiating calories like packed around their workout, instead of like really trying to get their the macros for the day they have to hit dialed in.
Absolutely.
Well, and those are liquid meals, so clearly they're free calories.
That's right. Like that's something we see where a lot of guys who want to get lean,
yeah, exactly.
They're so afraid to lose muscle, right? That they'll have like a protein and calorie drink, like a surge type product or something like that while they're training, and then their overall intake for the day is actually too high because they had 300 extra calories of protein and carb supplements while they're training, which just is necessary, right? That's what that research even shows. Like you bookend your session that during workout nutrition, especially for weight loss, is not necessary. For guys who you're trying to squeeze in every last calorie possible to gain weight, there might be a place for it. For endurance athletes, definitely a place for it, right? At the highest level of sport, like with my work with the San Antonio Spurs, for example, like there's a time and a place for it. But for most of us, for like myself, who works out 3-4 times a week, there's little to no need.
Right, and I guess that's part of the confusion. A lot of the research and literature is based around athletes, highly competitive athletes, and then people, I guess, try and
extrapolate it, right?
Extrapolate that and project that onto themselves when they're not professional.
One's training 12 hours a week, one's training 3 hours a week, right? There's a big difference,
I guess it's a huge difference, and then I guess the pre-post workout strategies for triathlete or for professional boxer is gonna be vastly different.
Right. Than my 45-minute weight workout. Right.
Right. So I guess if you are someone that is training potentially twice a day, up to 4 hours a day, I guess the specifications are much different. Like you'd want to refill on a bunch of carbohydrates immediately after training to quickly restock glycogen then?
Absolutely. Just because in that case, speed of replenishment is imperative, right? If they're going to do 2 glycogen depleting sessions a day, then speed of replenishment is critical. If you're working out on Monday and you're going to hit weights again on Tuesday or Wednesday, you're going to refill your glycogen over 24 hours easily, just with a normal carbohydrate intake. But if you're a high-level athlete, a triathlete or a UFC fighter, for example, who might do grappling work and then weight work and then, excess conditioning work in addition, because that's just what fighters do. Speed of glycogen replenishment is really important. But for most people, most of the time, it's simply not.
Okay. And is there going to be improved nutrient partitioning when you get the bulk of your calories and carbs around training or I guess after training as opposed to a different part of the day? And I guess it might be very, very extremely hard to quantify how much that difference that would make in the grand scheme of things.
It's a good question, and it's something that I think most people in my line of work will tell you is true, but to what degree I don't think any of us are really sure. It's probably still a really good idea to get in a good chunk of your carbohydrates, or at least make sure you're consuming carbohydrates post-training, because you're going to better tolerate them. You're going to better utilize them for glycogen replenishment, to oxidize as fuel, right? Things of that nature. And it'll help with your recovery. Right? We show improved next day performance. The list goes on and on. Does that mean it's going to make you like tremendously leaner if you put all your carbs post-workout versus spread out throughout the day? The research doesn't really necessarily seem to support that. You look at the data, and there are studies where people have the majority of their carbs and calories at breakfast versus the majority at night, and the data is equivocal. In some cases, breakfast is superior. In some cases, at night is superior. What that really tells us is it just comes down to personal preference and results. If you're someone who does best with majority of your carbs post-workout, then do it. If you're someone who does best with the majority at breakfast or at dinner, then do it. Don't stick to any one dogmatic approach just because it's a persuasive expert telling you so. Find what works best for you and follow it.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess all this talk about carbs, before and after training. I mean, let's pull back and talk about carbs in general. And what are your thoughts on this? For someone that wants to get very, very lean, on doing like a low carb approach, like maybe 150 grams or less a day, or maybe even like 50 to 80 grams. And I guess what's your experience with kind of going low carb as far as your experience and research and stuff of that nature?
Sure. I mean, lowering carbs is definitely an effective method for weight loss, right? I think that's unquestionable at this point. I mean, especially if you're lowering calories at the same time. However, like at PN, what we teach for, assuming you eat like those 4 meals a day, we recommend men eat about 2 cupped handfuls, if you can see my hands, 2 cupped handfuls of carbohydrates at each meal, and women about 1 cupped handful. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, men don't necessarily need twice as many calories and twice as many carbs as women, but it's just to give people a really good framework, easy way to control portions, and just to go from there. Now, what we also teach is if you want to lose weight, maybe you remove 1 to 2 cupped handfuls a day from your intake. Could be we also teach thumbs of fat, so it could be a thumb of fat as well. But in this instance, so we'll use carbs. So if we're assuming 2 cupped handfuls, that comes out to about 40% of your calories from carbs. So it's a pretty moderate carbohydrate intake. However, we definitely know, and we've found, and I've written about, that to me, carb needs to fall in like a bell curve. Most people do pretty well with that moderate intake, 2 cupped handfuls for men and 1 for women per meal. However, there's one standard deviation away who do better with just 1 for men, 1 cupped handful, or women a half of a handful of carbs at each meal. And even at the farthest end, there are people like on that's more like that 150 grams a day or a little bit less you're talking about. Mm-hmm. On the farthest end, where you're talking like a ketogenic diet, right, for 50 grams of less per day, you're talking basically 0 cupped handfuls, maybe 1 cupped handful a day, a little bit of fruit, basically getting it from vegetables, essentially. And so there are people who exist that definitely thrive on that kind of diet. To me, they're a small segment of the population. Like, again, that bell curve, most are in the middle. You have that chunk, about 15% of the population, who probably does really well with just 1 cupped handful or half a cupped handful per meal. And then it's like 2% of the population does best on a ketogenic diet. Definitely seen it work with clients. If I'm working with someone where they're going low carb and it's effective, we roll with it. If I'm working with someone who's going low carb and it's not working, or noticing some negative aspects, then I try to encourage a different approach. I have seen it work. I've used it with clients personally. So one of the things, like I was saying, we'll start with that middle ground, but we do pull back carbs because you only want to minimize protein so much, right? There's a bare minimum for protein you definitely want to hit, and then in reality, there's probably a bare minimum of fat you want to hit. Carbs are the most variable, depending on activity level, on goals, on need. So if you are trying to get ultra lean, and you're already down to 10% body fat, and you're trying to get down to 6, 7, in that case, you're getting into levels of body fat that are pretty much like supraphysiological levels, right? Most people aren't going to achieve those levels. You're not just going to happen upon them. They take a serious and concerted effort. So in that case, yeah, you're probably going to have to go lower carb. Is it something I would recommend for most people? Probably not, but for instances like that, absolutely.
Okay, yeah, very interesting. And I've always, definitely felt that carbs have the most variance. I used to do the low carb approach, and ultimately it was not for me. There were a lot of the pros definitely were outweighed by the cons. Mm-hmm. It can temporarily help, like, kind of keep a good, like, curb hunger very well. but like poor sleep, poor sex drive, poor training, not it was not worth it. And so it's interesting whenever you work with clients or you talk to different people. I mean, it's interesting to see kind of what they gravitate towards, because some people can eat like very little fat. I mean, the less than 20% of their calories from fat, and that makes me like scratch my head. I'm like, if I did that, I would kill someone. And then they can eat tons of carbs, and they love it, and they do it. And I guess that was like the old school bodybuilding approach, where they eat very high carbs, high protein, like minimal fat. Right. But then there's other people that literally, if they eat a carb, they go into like a food binge.
Right.
Maybe that's psychological, but
there is some physiology to it, right? I mean, you look at like there are genes for amylase, which is the enzyme in your saliva that helps to start breaking down carbohydrates. There are people who have like 1 copy, and there are people who have like 10 copies. So it's just, that's just one example of a genetic difference. Then you can get into different levels of insulin sensitivity, different levels of GLUT transporters on cells. I mean, there's any number of things that are going to affect the way people, different bacteria in your gut, right? Different probiotics in your gut that will handle them differently. There are any number of things that differentiate people on carb needs, carb tolerance. If you're an endurance athlete, you have a much higher demand for carbohydrates, right? You're expending a tremendous amount of carbohydrates. If you're a power lifter, how many carbohydrates are you really expending, right? If you're doing 8 sets of 1 rep, I mean, you're not really expending a whole lot of glucose. And maybe in some of your volume work, you're expending a little bit, but you're right, carb intake is driven by many things: goals, weight loss or weight gain, need, so type of training that you're doing, genetics, type of build you have. If you have a family history of metabolic syndrome or diabetes, or you have metabolic syndrome, right, you're going to do better with a lower carb intake. You have a disease where you don't tolerate glucose well. So there are many things at play, but overall, most people won't be able to process all of that on their own and figure out exactly what their carb needs are. That's how we start pretty middle of the road, and then you can adjust from there based on what you respond best to. You're right, because some people do great with a high carb intake. It's that same bell curve. That other 15% do better with 3 cupped handfuls for men at each meal. And then even a small percentage will do best with like 4 cupped handfuls. They'll have like 70% of their calories from carbs, and they thrive on it. But they're, again, a tiny percent of the population.
Right. No, that's very interesting, the genetic differences in terms of how you tolerate carbs. And it's interesting because I personally, for myself, and actually a lot of people, I've noticed that certain carbs can be just a bad dietary decision as far as cutting is concerned. I mean, for me, if I eat rice or pasta, there's a bottomless pit. There's very little signal telling myself that I'm full. Right. Conversely, when I eat like fruits and potatoes and sweet potatoes, I get full. Like same way as I would to eat a piece of meat, like the potatoes or whatnot, it fills me up, and so I can get quite a bit of carbs and keep my calories controlled, as long as I'm as long as I pick my carbs wisely, right, so to speak. And that kind of goes against the whole flexible dieting approach, but I have that in mind at the back. But I have to fill up on my macros with whichever's going to get the job done and make me most satisfied. Yeah,
and it's pretty interesting that you say that too, just because around like the whole topic of dieting in general, a lot of people that I've talked to automatically assume that like if you're going on a diet or if you're trying to restrict your macros or calories in any way, that you have to keep carbs to a minimum. And I've found personally, if I keep carbs to a minimum, I'm miserable. And by introducing a moderate amount of carbs, I keep it to about between 30 to 35% of my macro intake a day, which I know that it's there because I've actually done the weighing of the food and calculating and everything. And
you're a better man than I.
Well, I started out that way. Now I can eyeball it. So, but I mean, it's a task though. But when I introduced carbs back into my diet, not only was I able to hit my macros a lot more consistently, but I felt a lot more satiated. And I think a lot of people try to cut carbs out of their diet because of the books that they've read or magazine articles or whatnot. And it's really a shame because to me it makes dieting so much harder.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I found personally, and in working with clients over the past 10 years, carbs definitely help increasing satiety. And like you were talking about with potatoes, how you find they really help fill you up. there's something called the satiety index. Now, it's very minimal amount of research, but what they did was feed people foods and then see how long they felt satisfied. And potatoes were far and away the highest, like far and away higher than any other food on the list. And there's a difference between satiation, which is how full you feel after a meal. Like you could eat a big salad and be like, wow, I'm full because of the volume of food. But within like an hour, you're hungry again, right? Because there wasn't a lot of calories there. That's called satiety. So there's a difference between satiation and satiety. And so how satisfied you are between meals is satiety. And so potatoes are really helpful there. And most times having any type of fibrous carb will definitely assist with satiety. So like oatmeal or sprouted grains or legumes, right? Having some beans. They all vary, and there are between people variations. Some people get fuller from or stay more satisfied from potatoes and sweet potatoes. Other people can eat rice and feel satisfied. So it depends on the person. But definitely, I couldn't agree more that I found in my work with clients, we've just found at Precision Nutrition in general, going too low carb for too long for most people leads to some of the problems that we were discussing earlier, like the low sex drive, poor sleep. Because what really happens is when you're going low carb and you're exercising hard, what will happen, what the research even shows, testosterone drops, cortisol goes up, thyroid can go down a little bit. There are some negative aspects. Now, it can lead to weight loss, but at what cost? You can go a little bit more moderate, attenuate those problems, kind of prevent those problems from happening, and lower your fat just a little bit, and still achieve the weight loss without some of the negative impacts.
Right. Okay. We covered some awesome topics. There's just one last thing that I want to kind of wrap up and finish off with, you talk a lot about achieving deep health, and that kind of goes beyond eating and exercise to a certain degree. And so, what are the components of achieving deep health outside of the kitchen and I guess maybe outside of the gym?
A lot, actually, right? Like there's, when it comes to deep health, we're not just talking about physical health, we're talking about mental health, emotional health. You can even get into spiritual health. For example, things you can do to help it would be, like adequate sleep, like you were talking about the sleep issues you ran into. How many people do you know, how many clients do you have, especially high achieving like business clientele who get 4 hours of sleep a night, but it's like a badge of honor, right? Oh, I only sleep like 5 hours a night, and they say they can thrive on it. But in the reality, what we see over and over again, people increase their sleep, right? They feel better, they exercise better, they start losing weight, because sleep deprivation increases risk of diabetes, right? It decreases your ability to tolerate carbs, again, another factor, right? It increases inflammation. I mean, it negatively impacts you in so many different ways. So getting better sleep, right? Quality and quantity, using things like meditation, yoga, deep breathing exercises, even drinking green tea can actually help de-stress. Like you need some level of stress in your life. That's what actually helps you to be productive, right? So if you don't have any stress, it can actually be detrimental. You need an appropriate amount of stress, the right amount of stress, right, over the course of a day or time period. We need to also respond to that stress well. So things like I was saying, like appropriate sleep, meditation, and yoga can definitely help you. It can rewire your brain to actually better manage stress, decrease inflammation. I mean, it improves so many different health markers and improves your resiliency, right? Which is a term we talk about a lot at PN. Being more resilient to life and to life stressors will just make you a much healthier person overall. You'll be able to tolerate when you do get high levels of stress, because it happens, right? Life happens, work things happen, financial things happen, family stuff happens. Being able to tolerate it better goes a really long way. We also talk about getting fresh air and sunshine, like being connected to the real world, having a social network. There's evidence of isolation, like being isolated from other people is just as detrimental as basically like smoking 15 cigarettes a day, for some of the other stuff that was related to. I mean, really, really horrific things, being just as unhealthy for you as some really horrific things. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. Like if you picture like old prison movies, like what do they do to punish people? They put them in isolation, right? Because you drive yourself insane. You're just sitting in there with no one to talk to. Humans are social creatures. So if you don't have a social network and are consistently socializing with people, that can negatively impact you. So there are even more layers, but I think those are three pretty big ones: sleep, stress management, socialization.
Right. Okay. So a couple things real quick. I mean, you talked about meditation, and the research on the benefits of meditation are extensive and profound. Have you personally started meditating, and is that something that you talk to a lot of clients about? Yeah.
It's something like in our RPN coaching program. It's a habit. It's something we have people try to practice to add in. We just start with like 5 minutes a day of meditation, and then to slowly build it up. Personally, I don't meditate much, but what I do for the same kind of benefit, I do a little bit of yoga with my wife. I walk my dog every day in sunshine, in fresh air. I live like on the outskirts of a city in Maine, if you really can call it that. And so I get lots of trees and fresh air, and so I get outside, I get to be with my pet. Like there's a lot of benefits just to that are comparable to meditation. I probably should actually do more meditation, but personally, no, don't do much.
Right. Yeah, I've always kind of flirted around with the idea of doing meditation for a while, and I have done it a little bit. But I guess the concepts of meditation is just to become very present to the moment, settle your mind, and I guess there are other ways to do that without sitting and staring at a wall for 20 minutes.
And that's exactly what we teach. Like, and within that habit, we talk about some of those exact things. Like, you don't have to sit there with your fingers like in a Zen pose, like you picture people just staring at a wall. Like, that's not what's required to meditate. I mean, you can do that, right? It can work, but there are other ways to go about achieving the same benefits and just clearing your mind. When I go for a walk, it's just things kind of come and go into my head, but I don't necessarily try to think about any one thing in particular. Just to get some sunshine and be outside and do a little bit of, we do a little bit of yoga, like I said, 1 or 2 times a week. Same kind of idea. You're getting the breathing aspect of it. You're slowing everything down. You're kind of clearing your mind. So it's more like a moving meditation. But we're not perfectly consistent with it, but it's a very similar approach.
All right.
Awesome.
I think we've covered some amazing topics, and this has been a packed episode. Thank you so much again for coming on. Is there anything that you have coming up soon? And if people want to find you or take a look at what you got going on, where should they go?
Well, a couple of things. First, just go to precisionnutrition.com. We have a lot of stuff going on there. I write a lot of articles for the site. I go out and give seminars all over the U.S., which I tend to record, and then we post on the site for people to listen to as well. In terms of what we have going on now, we actually have our Precision Nutrition certification launching in a week and a half, maybe, something like that, 2 weeks. I think about 2 weeks, maybe next week. I should probably know that, within a week or so. So definitely something to keep your eye on. We work with tons of fitness professionals, people like yourselves, to become Precision Nutrition certified and learn about not just the physiology of nutrition, like the art of coaching nutrition, because that's just as important. We can talk all day about how many carbs are best for this and what nutrient timing is best for here and there, but if you can't actually coach that to people in a way that's empathetic and that they will actually follow through on, then you're basically an academic, which is nothing wrong with being an academic, but that's not an effective coach.
Right. Okay. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks again. And if you guys want to take a look at that, go to precisionnutrition.com. All right. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.
Take care, guys.